Okay, well, I'm excited to be here. This is the time of the year when I get to come to my ancestry and learn that the way I pronounce my name apparently has been wrong my whole life. We say Wahlin in the U.S., and I come here and it's like Wahlin or something like that. So it's good to be here. I am really excited about a particular topic that we're going to cover here because I once had a manager actually say to me, well, Angular is based on JavaScript, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, then we probably don't need a ton of planning for the app, right? Because it's just JavaScript. And it's one of those comments where you try not to laugh because you don't want to, it's a client. And of course, then I had to go through this concept of, no, we still have to plan. Now, back in ancient times, we used to plan using different devices such as this. Your relatives long ago might have used one of these, a whiteboard. And we could plan our parties, our raids, maybe they were for a Viking. Apparently the wheel was invented using the whiteboard. And then, as times have progressed, we got more modern. And I don't mean that modern, I mean that. And we can actually start to document. Now, I joke about this, and to be honest, in 20 minutes, there's no way we can do an actual architecture type session. But the goal of what I want to talk about today is what are some of the key things that before we start a project, we should be, whether it's a whiteboard or a piece of paper or whatever it may be, that we should actually be documenting and planning. And we're going to cover a few kind of key concepts here. So number one, what planning process are you using for your apps? A lot of you might be moving, for instance, an older desktop app forward. Maybe it's some legacy code. Some of you are probably on a greenfield project where you get to start from scratch. That's actually kind of nice when you have that. Regardless of what it is, what's your planning process? And if you don't have one, I'm going to give you 9 things that at a minimum, I always like to go through with companies as we work on this. Now, how you organize your modules. How many have, you don't have to raise your hand necessarily unless you just want to be like, yep, we did that. How many have created an app where you got to the end of it, you rolled it out, and then things like lazy loading and other cool features, you're like, shoot, we can't do that now because you had like a single module or something. I've had many companies. Yeah, and I did too when I started, because you just don't know. So for those especially that might be a little bit newer to this, we're going to talk about just some basics on what we can do and kind of a thought process there. Now we're also going to talk about a different pattern called the container presentation pattern for actually structuring components in your application. We're going to go into component communication. This gets into Matt, actually. In fact, Matt has agreed to take over the second half of my talk. I know we didn't talk about it, but is that all right? Yeah, he's like, no. We're going to talk about a little bit on subject, which is something that is very powerful in RxJS. We'll go into that a little bit. And then finally, what do you have for state management? Now, some of you that went to my buddy John Papa's workshop might recognize some of this, and that's because about 4 years ago, I started getting requests from companies for, hey, it's great that our devs know services and data binding and routing and all that, but we need to take it up a notch. And we need to have more planning involved for what we're going to do. So I started to create some content. And then it's been over 1.5 years ago, John and I started doing some workshops on these concepts. Some of you might have went to John's. I did one last week up in Sweden, actually, same one. And so I'm going to talk about some of those concepts. Those that got to the workshop, well, you'll get a nice little review, I guess. So first off, application planning. If your idea of planning is let's have like a 5-minute meeting, scrum, sprint, whatever you want to call it, meeting, stand up, and all right, let's code. Go, Sander. Code. No, I don't mean go. No. The premise of let's just jump in and start coding because it's JavaScript just doesn't work anymore. Some of you are probably on some really large-scale apps, and if you don't plan those apps appropriately, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot. So I have kind of 9 things I like to do. And I like to think of it this way. You can see this is a very old picture. You can tell by the jackets they're wearing. Those are true Vikings there. Yeah. Anyway, I thought it was a cool picture, though. So what concepts should you plan for? Because, again, you might say, well, we need to organize services and modules and things like that. But there's a lot more to the story. So let's talk about 9 key things. Now I want to emphasize these are 9 what I'm going to call like bare minimum things. You might have to deal with and work with accessibility, UX, all kinds of other stuff, but these are 9 kind of primitives, I'm going to call them, that at a minimum you would want to do in my opinion. So number 1, I hope you know what the app you're going to build is about. Okay, that's an easy one. Like, what is the app? What's it going to do? Kind of some of the basics there. Now, hopefully we all have that. Now, what are the app features? Now, this is where it gets actually really important. And you might go, well, that's kind of, yeah, the app features, that's easy. You know, I have customers, I have orders, I have invoices, whatever. Well, but that is going to lead us to a good module design for our application. So it's really important that we think through this. Oftentimes, a company that I'll go into, they will think they know the features they have. And then as we start talking about it, they start to realize that, oh, we might want to break these up into some other features. It's too big. Next, what security do you have? Now, we all know that JavaScript is phenomenal at browser security, right? No. We, of course, have to rely on the server side to do that. So whether you're using Node.js or Ruby or Java or .NET, whatever it may be, we're going to have to rely on the server. But how are we going to pass credentials if we have roles or groups? What technique are we going to use to do that? That's going to influence services and things that we'll have, of course, in our Angular app. What domain rules do we have? What business rules do you have? Where are they going to run? Client side, server side. If you have a really CPU intensive one, we might want to offload that to the server side. So we should think through those things. This is probably the number 1 thing that I see most apps don't have. If your idea of logging in production is console log, then you might want to reconsider that, right? Because my mom hits your app, and my mom's name is Elaine, and Elaine has a problem. So first off, you're going to bother me, because guess who she's going to call? She's going to call me, because I am tech support for the family. Is anyone else tech support for your family? Yes, it is a lot of fun. You should try to install a router with your parents when they're non-technical. That's a lot of fun. But anyway, logging is super important. Now, this could be custom logging, a service on the server side. It could be something that you set up with a cloud, App Insights as an example on Azure, or whatever it may be, but definitely something to plan for. Now, that gets us also to services. We'll probably have a logging service. We might have an auth service. We might have other types of services, but we need to talk about them. And do we have any real-time data that we're going to be sending back and forth? If we do, maybe some of those services are going to be subscribing to something like WebSockets on the server side. What are your data models? What are we going to send over the network? Because we don't want to be sending these huge blobs of data if we can avoid it to make it even more performant. And then how are we going to organize our components? And finally, what shared functionality would be in the app? Now, again, these are kind of my minimum 9 things that any team I go work with, we go over these 9 things. And then, of course, we always have other things. Now, what I usually do here is super simple. I'll literally set up a Google Slides link, and that way everybody in the room can contribute at the same time as we're talking about these. And by using Google Slides, you laugh at that, but it forces you to think small. Instead of, does anybody get delivered like this 50-page, 100-page document for your app before? And then you got to spend a week just reading through it. Now, I have at the end, I'll give you a link to the slides so you can get to these templates, but I have just a blank template, and then I have a real simple example of putting these together. Now, that's kind of my first thing. Now, that leads us into module organization. And I like to think of Angular apps, they're kind of like Legos. Well, actually, I heard I say it wrong. It's Lego. Somebody corrected me on that, and given that I'm in the home of that, you probably know better. So I literally think of apps that we build as a component is like a Lego block. A service is a different type of Lego block. And then we, of course, need to organize these Lego blocks into buckets. Of course, the bucket we would call a module. And that's why some of this planning is really important. Now, when it comes to doing this, hopefully everybody already does it and has read the style guide. If you haven't, you should read the style guide. There's a lot of good info, got a lot of good insight into that. And one of the things I pretty much always start with, and I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule because it depends, but I usually start with a feature will then have typically a routing module, possibly Maybe not, but possibly. And then that'll be loaded into the feature module. I can't even tell you how many companies I've gone into who have enterprise scale projects who don't do this, and then down the road they wonder why they can't do other things like lazy loading and things like that. So very easy to do. If we had an orders feature, of course you're going to have a routing probably module, and that's optional. Depends on how you like to do it, but I still like to do that. And then we'll have a feature module for orders. Very, very simple. So that's another thing that I think is very important to plan for early on as the team is discussing this. Now, the next thing that comes up, how many have worked in an app that has deeply nested components and you never know which component's making the changes? Probably some of us, right? And it gets a little bit messy, and that's usually where state management comes in, which I'll wrap up with. One pattern that I like to follow is called the container presenter or presentation pattern. And the idea here is that you have a parent component, which we're going to call the container, and its job in life is to be able to go get data from services. That's all it does. And then it's going to pass that data down to what we're going to call presentation. Now, a lot of you that maybe haven't heard of this pattern might be going, isn't that just parent-child? No, it's more than that. The difference is that the children here, they never know how to actually go get the data. They literally are renders. They know how to take data and do something with it and maybe pass it back to the parent. But the point is we're able to, from a maintenance standpoint, update things in one place. Makes it really, really nice there. So you can think here of the container as the one that manages the state of the children. And I don't mean the full state of the app. I just mean what the children need. And then, of course, the children can now present that in the UI. So to kind of sum that up, we have a container component. Its job is to go get that data from a service. It then passes typically through input properties down to the children. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. And then the presentation components are then going to render this data. Now, a couple things on that then. So as you're passing from the container to the presentation, typically we'll use input properties. How do you go back up? Well, that's easy. That's just normal Angular, right? Typically an output property. Now, when it comes to the children, though, the presentation, I almost always set the change detection strategy to on push. And some of you probably do this as well. Now, the reason, a lot of people say that's for performance. Actually, the reason I do it is to protect myself from myself. By doing this, only inputs or events, certain types of events, will cause the DOM to update in that child. Well, I don't want one of you going in and manually writing code to change that data because that data is supposed to come from the parent. So this will help you stop that across the team. And all of a sudden you're like, why isn't the UI updating? Because there's an on push on it. Very important to consider, and I'll have some sample code if you're new to this that you can go through a little bit later. Now the presentation components, UI doesn't change, ng on changes doesn't fire until the input, an output, or a specific type of DOM event fires. And that's why that on push can be very useful. Now, another thing to consider here is when you're passing data in, how many have had a scenario where ng on changes didn't fire and you thought it should have, and it's because you passed a full object. So if you're already using a state management solution, you kind of have this, but if you're not, you might want to look into cloning concepts, where we're not always passing a reference, we pass a new copy of the object. And we'll talk about that to wrap up here in just a little bit. Now, the next big thing that I think is super, super critical with architecture, your app always starts out pretty easy, and then you can have an input, and then you're like an input, and an input, and then an output, that sounds messy. So component communication is a really, really important part of your architecture, in my opinion. How do components at different levels talk? Has anyone worked with an input to an input to an input to an input type scenario? And then maybe an output to an output? And it's kind of a house of cards. You pull one card out and the whole thing breaks, right? So I recently gave a talk at ngConf, which is online as well. You can get more details if you're interested it's related to RxJS and subjects. So what if I need to communicate from this child down here all the way up to a nav bar? What do we do? And the short answer is you just don't do that. You just tell the customer, sorry, we don't support that feature. No, don't do that. But what we do, or could do, rather than input all the way up to the app component, or output, I should say, is we could create some type of a service that would allow us to communicate in different directions across multiple components. How many have a dashboard? Anybody have a dashboard and you never know what's on there? Well, how are you going to have this component on the dashboard talk to this component if they don't know about each other? The short answer, Matt already showed. The Gang of Four book on design patterns, you could use one option would be the mediator pattern, it's called. That would be an event bus. So we'll talk about this real quick. So an event bus is basically something in the middle that this component can send a message to it. This component can then hook to that event bus and then get that data. Well, by using this, I can have a very loosely coupled way of exchanging data throughout an entire app without any complex state management. Now, this is more for messaging. I want to kind of emphasize that because if you do have more serious state management needs, which I'll wrap up with next, then you're going to have to deal with that, of course. But when it comes to this type of approach, which I'm going to show you briefly here, this works well. I wouldn't abuse it, though. I think this concept can actually lead to harder to maintain code because you don't know where the data is coming from. It's so loosely coupled that like a stranger sends you the data. And it's almost like, I don't know how it is here in Denmark, but in the US, you get these stupid marketing calls, at least 5 a day. And now you just don't answer your phone unless you see that person, the person. That's kind of this approach. Now, the other approach is what's called, and sorry, my voice is already going. I've been a little under the weather here for the last 2 days. But observable service. This is probably my favorite pattern, actually. And what this pattern will do is allow us to have a service that we can subscribe to. That way we know where the data is coming from. And then as data changes, we just do the normal subscription that Matt just talked about and then unsubscribe. Very simple. So before I wrap up with some state management options, let me just really quickly show, there's going to be a project at the end, and I'll have a link where you can get to the project. Those that did the workshop, you would have seen it. But let me open this up to wrap up here. And we'll go to this one. Okay. So you'll notice right up top, this is a service. And let me actually zoom that a bit. There we go. Notice on line 90 there, we have this customer subject, a behavior subject. Now, I won't have time to go into the main subjects out there. You have subject and replay subject and async subject and another. But this is the main one I like to use. What this does is if you subscribe, then as Matt showed, sadly, I'm horrible. I didn't bring any candy to throw at you, right? I got to think about that next time. Throw candy. What this will do, though, is if you subscribe to a subject, then you'll get any future data. But what happens if somebody subscribes later? Do they get the previous data? No. With the behavior subject, you'll always get the previous value of that data. Now, you'll notice on line 90 and 91, so 90 creates the behavior subject. It's going to return some customers up there. And then on line 91 there, you'll notice that I'm exposing that as an observable. Now, I could expose the subject to you directly, but then you would be able to send data out, and I don't want that. So I'm only going to expose the observable here. All right, now, anybody that now wants to get to this data can now inject the service into their component and then subscribe to that customer's change, just like you're used to with HTTP client. And as Matt demonstrated as he kind of threw some stuff out here, you would now have the ability to get to that and then unhook anytime you want. And if you subscribe later, you'll always get the last value of the customers. Now, there's a lot more to this story, more than I have time to go into, unfortunately. Okay, but I'll have some demos for you. And if you would like, you can go into the details there in the app. All right, now the last big thing that I think is a really, really important one is to evaluate whether or not you actually need a full-blown state management solution. I'm going to offer there are some apps, believe it or not, that don't. There are some apps that absolutely do. I think the problem I'm seeing these days, though, is somebody, here's a conference talk or goes to a training session or whatever, they hear about state management and they assume I got to have it. A lot of apps do, don't get me wrong, they do. But a lot of apps, I'm gonna argue, don't. There's a whole bunch you could do with just pure RxJS and to pass data around to keep it all synced from one source. Now, there obviously, though, having said that, are apps that you might need to have this. Now, how do you know? Well, if you have this type of scenario, all right, where you have a service injected into components, well, it's pretty clear where these components are getting the data here. And if we have others, no big deal there. But what happens when this starts to occur? All right, now a service is used here, and then also that service is used there, and okay, now things start to get complex because I ask you, where did the data come from? And you go, I don't know, actually. I can't figure it out. And that's a pretty good indicator where you might need a state management solution there. Now, there are many of these out there. Observable service is what I just kind of showed, at least the basics of it. That might get the job done. I'm going to argue in more complex apps, that probably won't get the job done, but it would be a good communication mechanism. NGRX, of course, gets a lot of the press these days. That can be very powerful, but you better know the pattern well. If you have a larger team, I have seen where it works great when everybody knows it, but when they don't, it turns out to be horrible. And it's not because of the pattern it has a problem. It's because people didn't realize what they were doing as they used the pattern. So it's more education there. NGRX data, if you haven't heard of this or used it, this is new. This is something that just got merged like 3 weeks ago, I think, into NGRX. This will take what would have been, I think, like 400 lines of code per entity down to like 1 or 2. And you'll still get the same time travel debugging for those that use NGRX right now. Pretty cool. I personally like to keep it as simple as possible. So I have a package out there called Observable Store, and that's actually what I use. It's based on RxJS. In fact, I was trying to add to what Matt said. He goes, let's look at my watch, and there'll be another 5 of these, come out. But it's a very simple way to get very powerful features for state management without tons of complexity. MobX, some of you might have heard of. That's a little more popular in the React world. Akita, Matt also mentioned that one. And there's even more, like NGXS and others. So I'm out of time. So to wrap up here, number one, if you don't have a planning process, spend time making a planning process. I'll give you this little template, a link to it here at the end. Number two, take a feature-based approach to organizing your modules. I think that's one of the number one easy things you can do to have better app maintenance down the road as your app grows. Number three, observables are awesome. So if you're not comfortable with them right now, take some time to learn them. I still, to this day, encounter some scenarios. I think this is one of those, if you meet someone who goes, oh, I'm a master of RxJS, you probably want to run far away from them. Because I think anyone that says that probably hasn't done every scenario. I think I'm pretty good at it, but I still hit things that I don't know and have to look up. Determine if you need a state management solution. Don't just assume you do, because I've seen so many apps where they add all this complexity and they just didn't need it for that app. So I think every app needs to be evaluated on a case by case. And then if you do, pick the right solution. So with that, thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Here's where you can get to the project that has a whole bunch of this in it. And I'll let Kenneth come on up. So thank you very much.